Hello, Art 109 students. I am here to start our course lecture around our next unit, who is going to focus on the work of Wangechi Mutu. We should have watched the Art 21 video before watching this lecture video. So if you haven't watched that yet, then pause this and go back to that. Then you're going to listen and watch this course lecture video, and then there are going to be about 3 other videos you're going to watch after this lecture video. They're going to be more specific to some different bodies of work of the artist. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So as we already saw in the video, Wangechi Mutu was born in Nairobi, Kenya in 1972. She ended up coming to the United States when she decided to receive her BFA and MFA from 2 different schools in New York City. And now at this point, she has probably lived in the United States more than she lived in Nairobi in terms of the course of her life. But in the R21 video, we see that she actually just recently moved back to Nairobi and built a studio that she was working in during that video. As you saw in the video, she works in a variety of mediums, including collage, drawing, sculpture, and film. And if we had to sum up her work in terms of some themes, she focuses mainly around femininity, but within that, she examines ideas of cultural identity, colonial history, and global consumption, and uses a lot of repurposed materials. So whether that be for her collages from like fashion magazines or medical diagrams, but she also brings in old artifacts that relate to the traditional African arts, and she's very interested in using organic materials from nature. In the video, she talked a little bit about being in the garden around her home and spending a lot of time outside, and how that very much connects to her experience of using nature and getting back to nature through her work. But I also found an article that she wrote for the Smithsonian National Museum of Art, where she talks about growing up and visiting her grandmother's house. And it was a little bit outside of Nairobi, which is the city that she grew up in. And because it was outside of Nairobi, the native language of Kiyuku was still being spoken. And she found that because in the city had long before the time she was a child, had been taken over by British colonization. So English was the sort of dominant language. So she found when she went out to the countryside, not only was she surrounded by nature, but she was surrounded by Nairobian culture. And those 2 experiences, we'll see later, really have influenced her body of work. Her mom was a nurse and a midwife, and is perceived by Mutu as a healer. And it is certainly interesting to connect that to her use of different organic materials, and that how the notion of her obsession with ink and solvents, liquids, paper, surfaces, and connecting them to their organic qualities, sort of bringing down the fact that, a paper comes from a tree and I'm utilizing in this work, is very important to Mutu's body of work. And she goes on to saying that my obsession with ink, solvents, liquids, paper, and surfaces come from my belief in their live and organic qualities, as well as their association with elements like blood, saliva, milk, tears, sweat, and urine. So she had mentioned that she would go to the countryside in Nairobi to visit her grandmother. And in the video that we looked at, Mutu talks about the other and the history of photography and how that influences her early collages. The way that Africans, and in her case, she's focusing on Kenyans, so she's from the country of Kenya, she grew up in the city of Nairobi, that throughout colonial history, and in this case with Kenya, it was colonized by the British, they found that the people from Kenya were perceived as other. And this is a continent-wide issue in Africa and in many other countries that were colonized by white settlers, that they were seen as a spectacle. They were seen as being different. In much cases, they were seen as sort of primitive or uncivilized. And the colonizers saw themselves as people who were coming in to bring culture to these people's lives, to make them civilized, and then not only that, but also treated them as this sort of backdrop of spectacle as the other. And particularly, it's hard to find imagery of women from the time, but women were seen as these sort of fetishized, over-sexualized objects through a lot of this colonial photography. And I pulled some of colonial photography from the time period when the British colonizers were the most prevalent in Kenya. So these are all photographs from Kenya, except for the one on the bottom left. And in these photographs, you're going to see a few different examples of what Mutu was really trying to point out. So in the top left, we see quite literally that these Kenyans are seen as a backdrop to a white little girl who is perceived as perhaps a child of someone who was there due to colonization. And almost as if, look at this backdrop of like, let me pose in front of these people as if they are sort of seen as this spectacle. And that, in itself can be perceived as very xenophobic or very racist. We also see examples of white people coming in through colonization to sort of share their culture with the Nairobians. So on the left, we see, or the middle left, we see three women who are sitting at sewing machines, and these sort of like white people sitting over them, teaching them how to sew, as if, that we're going to teach you our ways of industry. On the right, we see a white person with a violin sort of teaching these young children how to be classical within music and kind of sort of civilizing them in terms of bringing in the humanities, which we can see in both of these photos. This is perceiving the fact that Nairobians that their culture is not good enough, right? That they are not civilized enough, and that if they were to bring in these Western ideals into their lives, that they would be so much better, right? So that was the sort of overarching theme of colonization. And Mutu is trying to re-envision this. She is trying to, in her work, not only is she trying to bring up this context and this history, but she is trying to reimagine how we are perceiving, particularly in her case, female Black bodies, and how we are no longer, she doesn't want them to no longer be othered. She does not want to see them in this racist trope, but rather empower them. But the inspiration for the imagery does very much come from this history of photography. And I included the bottom left-hand photo of the former First Lady because I wanted to point out the fact that, and I think Mutu would also point out the fact that these racist tropes and this idea of the other still very much exists in our society today. So this is not an old problem. This is something that's going on where the former First Lady in this photograph is wearing a hat that the fashion of this hat came from the period of colonization in Kenya. And so a lot of the colonizers from Britain would wear these hats, and they were designed particularly for their time in Africa, and in this case, Kenya. And the fact that she would go to Kenya, and this was in the present day, while she was former First Lady, or while she was First Lady, she came in wearing this colonizer hat, was very offensive to a lot of people, and a lot of people were really upset about it. So that insensitivity, right? It might not be that, she would consider herself a straight up racist, but just the insensitivity is an issue that Mutu is wanting to address in her work. And Mutu talks a little bit about that video that you watched, the Art 21 video, about the fact that growing up, she was rarely ever exposed to Kenyan culture. So the dominant language was English. So there was no sort of reference to her native tongue, but also there was a lack of talk about, Kenyan literature or music or art, or, all these different sort of components of the humanities in terms of folklore or stories or just general things that we would associate with culture were really missing for her because it was being taken over by these Western ideals. And this sort of missing hole is something that Mutu starts to want to build up on, wants to start to reimagine and sort of think about, what would happen if this never went on? What would happen if colonization never went on? What would happen if people from the continent of Africa weren't taken to be enslaved by different colonizing countries like America. How could we re-envision a future as well without this type of racist perspective? So we're going to see a reference to Afrofuturism, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But these are some questions that Motu asked in the same article from the Smithsonian National Museum of Art that relates to these ideas that I wanted to just point out in terms of historical uprooting and identity. So she says, I quote, "How does one talk about cultural decapitation or historical uprooting? How does one capture the moment after a limb has been severed or a nation's heart has been broken?" In her case, she's referring to Kenya, and she's talking very metaphorically here. She says, I quote, "How does one mix a salve to heal and protect a wound? And how does one create an anti-venom to twist the fate of someone who has been mistreated or maligned?" And when, looking at Motu's work, I think that she sees herself as that person who is creating the salve to heal, who is protecting those wounds, and who is reimagining things through this sort of anti-venom to this historically racist past. Here on the left-hand side is imagery from Mutu's work, Mutu's home, of photographs of her family, which felt appropriate for this discussion. So a couple sort of things that when Motu was asked to talk a bit about these collages, which would have been sort of her first body of work. So she talks about the history of photography and how she's sort of playing around with this idea of the other. But then she's also reimagining the way the depiction that a woman is portrayed, particularly Black women, are portrayed in consumerism. So when I say consumerism, I mean like in a magazine, right, or on a billboard, through marketing and through graphic design. And she mixes these things up, and she combines them with imagery from wildlife magazines and old vintage medical illustrations. And she creates these collages in which she is offering new mythologies to take these old Western perspectives place. So she's wanting to get rid of how we perceive women from this Western point of view. So in her case, she's talking about how Black women in particular were portrayed in this as the other because of the Western influence taking over Kenya. But in a broader sense, she's also referencing just how women have been portrayed in the Western society as sort of over-sexualized, not considered for who they are, but rather their bodies. And she even goes on to saying in that interview that she wants the viewer to read it for what it is. So it's not important necessarily to her that we see all of this history, but that we can, this is open to interpretation, and we can bring in our own context for deciding what the work is about. A couple of historic artists that Motu is often compared to are Hannah Hoch and Romer Bearden. And I just wanted to show you imagery of their work because I think it's important to see predecessors. And certainly Motu was exposed to both of these artists' work during her education. And we would call this sort of technique of collage photo montage, which is just the idea of taking existing print matter, existing photography, cutting it out, and refiguring it in this sort of collage format. And both of these artists are well known for taking this type of imagery to portray these composite forms that are different elements of humans. So neither of these artists really brought in this sort of hybrid of animals like Motu does, but they are reconsidering narratives through reconfiguring imagery. So they are similar in that way. And both of them would be sort of considered political artists like Motu is. Hannah Hoch was living in Germany in the 1920s and 30s when she was creating her work during the World War. Certainly influenced her perspectives of what it was to be a German at the time. And a lot of her work was sort of poking fun at aristocratic people in high power. And then Romer Bearden is an African-American artist that was probably the most popular in his time period, the most popular in the 40s and 50s during the civil rights era, and certainly is reconstructing narratives of the Black experience in North America. So one term I had already mentioned is this idea of Afrofuturism. And often Motu is considered as within this category of artists. And I'm going to start by defining Afrofuturism, and then I'll give you some examples of how Motu incorporates this into her work, particularly her collage work. So to define it is to say that it is a cultural aesthetic and fluid ideology shaped by generations of artists, musicians, scholars, and activists who aim to reconstruct Blackness and culture. Afrofuturism often combines science fiction, history, and fantasy to imagine a future void of white supremacy, of the white supremacist thought and structures that violently oppress Black communities. Afrofuturism addresses themes and concerns of the African diaspora through technoculture and speculative fiction. So we talked a bit about diaspora in our first unit when we talked about the context of women in art and art history and how that relates to this idea of the traditional Western perspective of art history, and that there is a diaspora well beyond the Western approach. And certainly Motu's work is looking at the Black diaspora, because not only is she thinking about colonization of her country, of Kenya, but she also has, spent time in America and is certainly thinking about Black diaspora as it relates to the fact that people were taken from the continent of Africa and enslaved in the United States. And both of these, have led to oppressed Black communities. And Afrofuturism is an approach for these different creative peoples and these activists to rethink, to reframe this history in a creative way through fantasy, through science fiction, to basically imagine a future where these narratives never existed in the first place. To say, what if people were not enslaved? What if Kenya was not colonized by Britain? What would these lives of these people look like? And it's a way to bring back power to these creative folks, to say, listen, these are our bodies and these are our minds and this is our culture, and we're going to take it back and we're going to reimagine. And where the science fiction and fantasy comes in is through the realistic perspective that there's no way to get rid of history, right? History exists and there's nothing we can do about it. But it's meant to be as sort of a coping skill, a coping mechanism for creative people, because of the sort of history of repression that has just taken down so many people throughout time. So where we look at Motu's work within this context of Afrofuturism is that she has long been engaged with this idea of human creation. She has long been engaged with critically looking at different issues of racism, nationalism, sexism, through the lens of focusing on these Black female forms to talk a bit about these issues. But she is doing so through the lens of speculative fiction, of mythology. She's bringing in natural ecologies, social ecologies. We can see here on the left-hand side that this collage form has imagery of roots, imagery of a fish, along with the female woman who's portrayed. We see bones, we see snake skins. We see a mythology, right? We see fantasy, but we also see a reimagining of Black women in a very strong perspective, right? They're not being sexualized in this like they might have traditionally been in photography as the other. They are taking back the power. They're harnessing the power of nature. They are showing themselves in this futuristic perspective. We looked at futurism when we looked at Wendy Red Star earlier on in the semester as well. She had that series where it was in space, where she and her daughter would be like on the moon, and they were sort of imagining a future where Native peoples were no longer suppressed. It's very similar to that same concept as well. So just a few other examples of Motu's work, particularly her collage work, which was really the first work that became really popular that she created. But again, we're seeing the Black female form sort of reimagined. So we see a lot of landscape in this work as well, reimagining the landscape, reimagining borders and what it means to live within a culture. There's violence still involved in this futuristic perspective. There's still ties to the violence that is associated with the Black experience and the Black diaspora. Here we see, a severed snake that is certainly got some violence, but it's as if she's taking on the power, like she's the one who's causing the violence versus the one who's having the violence upon them. So this idea of bringing back power is important here too. So another collage example, and this quote was from the Art 21 video we watched, where Motu says, I quote, "The way we worship the image of women, but degenerate the actual human being of women. That schism bothers me. So this brings back to what I said previously about, how women are portrayed in Western media and perceived as these sort of like we are worshiping their bodies, as if we are using their bodies to sell products. But, Mutu is really trying to get us to reimagine this. And in this particular example, we can see that she's bringing in some imagery from African art history through the mask. Typically, as we learned when we talked about decolonization in the museum in the beginning of the semester, we talked about how artifacts from the continent of Africa are often, seen through the lens of Western art. So they might take a mask and take it out of context and put it in a white wall museum. And this is very problematic. So the idea of using these masks and these different artifacts in her work is certainly bringing up that history. But okay, so back to this piece, this idea of the other and Black women being seen as overly fetishized, she is certainly owing to that, but then she's also bringing in the photo or museum relic of the mask, and her model becomes a sort of temptress through the exotic. And the woman is sort of taken over through the enveloping of the different imagery that we can see through the mask and almost the serpent things coming off her eyes. And kind of moving on into thinking about what this work is about. She's a cover girl who serves as this product of typecast and desire. And again, this is how throughout history we're perceiving these women portrayed as the other without the history of photography. And this work is very very much talking about power and taking power back. So these figures that Mutu is creating is really not only critiquing the colonial past and critiquing the way that women were perceived within that context, but then taking the power back. So another theme that we would sort of perceive Mutu's work around is this idea of the feminine. And if I had to say, I would say all of her works are really within this theme. She did a series where she took imagery from different medical medical mappings and different imagery used by doctors in the early sort of 1900s. And this is sort of Victorian, very European medical diagrams that were from these old medical books. And often those medical books are really well known for not only female anatomy being studied wrongly, right? Not looking at female anatomy in the way it really should be. So it has this history there, but also has a history of repressing Black people, because Black people were often overlooked by the medical community during that time. So she's using that, so that's got some heavy context, and you can see that's the back page of this work. So you can see, kind of blurry, but you can see at the top it says adult female anatomy here. And then she's taking that imagery and she's covering it up with all different other sort of visual cues to the collage. So talking about this sort of, we have the mask again, this idea of Africans being perceived with these masks, with this idea of sort of colonizing African artifacts. It is made of packaging tape, which is a reference to bandages or migration or quick fix solutions, which is very common in the history of the medical community and the mistreatment of Black people within that medical community. Portraying the inner and outer ideas of self with physical attributes clipped from lifestyle magazines, the woman's face being a racial distortion, her mind occupied by a prototypical white model, drawing from the aesthetics of traditional African crafts. Mutu is engaging her own form of storytelling. Her work is documenting this myth-making of endangered cultural heritage. So this is tying together a lot of the things that I've already said so far about this idea of how women are perceived through media and how it is skewing our self-identities, particularly that of women. Here's another example from the adult female sexual organs piece. So this was originally an illustration of tumors of the uterus that she then manipulated with different imagery to kind of play around with this sort of Afrofuturist perspective of by putting a woman's face, sticking their tongue out and saying, kind of taking the power back that, throughout history, particularly Black women were often oppressed in terms of the medical community. Often Black women were sterilized, and this is very prevalent even in as early as, or as,
within the 1980s even were sterilized in an effort to not be able to give birth. So taking a uterus and covering it with this like empowered woman who's sticking her tongue out is very subversive. It's commenting on this past. It's commenting on the fact that women were often discriminated against, particularly Black women in the medical field. So we also saw in that video Mutu working on the Sentinels series, which are these sort of freestanding female figures, still very much using composite forms where we have some sort of perspectives of the female body, but then we also have some found organic materials like sticks and bark, and even some sort of hidden artifacts that are referencing, again, sort of African artifacts and heritage. She is quoted in that video saying, "The sentinels are divine feminine forms, stable soldiers, guarding language and the earth that they are carved from. There is something about taking these bits and pieces of trees and animals and completely anonymous but extremely identifiable items and placing them somewhere that draws their energy." So I love this. It's very much a poetic perspective, right? It's like putting these artifacts combined with nature, combined with the female body, creates a sense of power. So just like her collages taking back the power of the feminine form, these sculptures are embodying the same idea. They're drawing energy. But in this case, they're much more focused on drawing the energy of the earth. And in one of the videos we're going to watch, Mutu talks a bit about soil and creates this sort of metaphorical perspective of the power of soil and the power of the earth. And she talks about how the soil in Kenya has so much more meaning to her. She feels like it's very rich and very organic, whereas she's comparing it to the soil of New York City, which many people know is very much toxic. It's contaminated with all kinds of lead and terrible things that, just are a result of industry within New York City. And she believes there is energy in these natural elements like the soil. She believes that due to, the soil in New York being toxic, that means something, that creates an essence that she no longer really could relate to, which is one of the reasons why she came back to Nairobi to live. But this perspective is important when looking at these pieces because their organic nature, the bark and, the sticks and the different things, the soil, she literally put soil on these as well, is meant to embody that energy, and particularly to tie it back to her home, to tie it back to this idea of place and land and landscape. So another sort of perspective on the sentinels is that they are hybrids, right? So they have a combination of legs that might end in a hoof from an animal. They might have a high-heeled shoe. The heads in a tree stump or French doormat might make a tribal crown. So we also are bringing in the African perspective in terms of crafts and different artifacts. Mutu explains that there's a softness to them, that even though they're dry and hard, they have a real relationship to the land. It's work that would not have happened without her return to Africa. Okay, so Mutu did an animation, a sort of stop motion animation with the musician Santa Gold, who she calls Santi. We're going to watch a little video at the end of this lecture that's going to go more into this collaboration that they created. But I want to be very clear that this is not a music video for Santa Gold. Instead, this is an art piece by Mutu that just so happens to have Santa Gold as the head of this sort of composite form. So we can see that the musician is starring in Mutu's piece. It's not the other way around. But this work is around the theme of global consumption. So as I just mentioned, Mutu has this really strong tie to the natural earth. Certainly, it is clear that the natural earth is important to her. And in the back of her mind, she's always thinking about this idea of global consumption. And for this piece, she explains, I quote, "I tried to push up the volume on how incredibly important every single plant, animal, and human is in keeping us all alive and afloat." When Santa Gold was asked about this work, she described it as Wangechi's concept behind the animation is talking about consumption. It speaks to our empty artistic environment. When art is supposed to be something that keeps renewing us culturally, it's like a pendulum that is so far over the wrong side, there's nowhere else to go. The end of eating everything, which is the name of the piece, being that far gone results in an implosive rebirth. So this piece in a way is almost apocalyptic. It's almost post-apocalyptic. So what, Motu is really trying to say here is like, what would happen if global consumption got to a point where, the world sort of ended? There's a lot of darkness here. There's a lot of this idea of things being done sort of due to our greed as humans. We have ruined nature. We're seeing this with climate change. So it makes sense that this is happening at the same time. But she is doing it in a much more fantasy way, right? She is looking at this large organic kind of bobular form that's coming off Santa Gold's neck that almost looks as if it has like a tumor or it's been sort of taken over. There are human limbs sticking out of it. It's being devoured or taken over by, or vice versa, it's taking over a flock of birds. It's almost as if it's a monstrous form, and it is very much sort of destructive and taking over, which is a metaphor for what humans are doing to the earth, to talk about consumption. And I'll let you go ahead and just watch the video to sort of learn a little bit more about the work itself. So I'm going to end our lecture with a couple newer works that Motu has created. This one being at the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And if you recall, when I talked about decolonization of museums, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has been heavily criticized for its lack of diverse artists, that being both women artists and then also artists of color in their collections and what they show. And they also have been really criticized for how they have displayed African art and how they've lumped all the different sort of countries of African art into sort of one display that is very much a European perspective because it comes from European collections. So they have this really complicated history. And to ask an artist like Wangechi Motu to come and create these site-specific sculptures is huge for the Metropolitan. It's a big step. And we're going to watch a video about this as well, where Mutu kind of explains that she is very sort of aware of the fact that this is a huge, huge step for the Metropolitan in terms of their ability to think about equity and inclusion in their collections. So the outside of the Metropolitan is this like old-fashioned, really fancy building in New York City. And there's this facade that has these pillars, but upon the pillars, they've always been empty. So the architects, of the Metropolitan never included any sort of statuary on these columns. And so Mutu is the first artist to ever be asked to create site-specific installations for the pillars, which is a big deal all in itself. So she created a series that she calls The New Ones Will Free Us. And then she created a series of different seated forms, which she calls the seated 1, 2, 3, and 4, that are all sitting in different areas of the facade of the Metropolitan. So when we look at their bronze sculptures, so they, can handle the elements and all of that. And they are kind of this ode to reimagining, which is, again, this perspective and technique of Afrofuturism, a sort of motif that is common to both the history of Western and African art, which is a caryatid. A caryatid is a Greek word for a sculpted figure that is almost always female that holds up structural support of a facade of a building. Okay, so if you think Greek, you think like old Greek columns, that kind of thing. And so she is reappropriating this idea of a caryatid, of this female form, but she is then bringing in, so that's a very Western ideal, because she is very much acknowledging the Western history here, for better or for worse. And then she's bringing in these sort of archetype forms that you would associate with African women, particularly high-ranking African women. So we see the coils that are around their necks, which is really common, an adornment. We see one of them has this sort of long circular mouthpiece that is sort of working as this sort of ornate armor. necklaces, bodices, beaded adornment. All of these things are sort of this way of looking at high-ranking African women, but she's making them into an archetype in that they're not from one particular country or one particular culture, but rather this more encompassing sort of power. Again, bringing power back to the feminine form. And really, like I just said, not belonging to one time or place. So that's another important sort of variable to this piece, is that it's not necessarily referencing just history, it's referencing the present too. And they are very much announcing their authority and autonomy through the placement on the facade, and is certainly bringing in new perspectives to the Metropolitan Museum of Art that we've never seen before. And you'll learn more about that in the video you're going to watch as well. So lastly, we're going to look at her most recent work that was actually done just this year. And I put this under the theme of sort of questioning humanity. And very similar to a lot of the other themes that she's done. But this particular work was created in a site-specific place of the Legion of Honor, which is where Rodin's Thinker is. And you can see that this is Motu leaning up against the Thinker right there. And she was invited to do a site-specific installation. This is in California, where she brought in some of her forms to sort of be circularly around the Thinker. And here we have some larger form sculptures. So one is called Mama Ray, which is that top image to the right side is Mama Ray. And she is portrayed as this sort of composite form that represents both a feminine form, a stingray. There's even kind of like an alien almost reference in the face that is very much representing power, poise, and this idea of the sort of dynamic nature. It's enveloping the space around her, demonstrating a harmony of balance and strength, as well as tenderness, encapsulated by the sheer force of nature. So she's not a force to be sort of reckoned with. She is the sort of symbol of the feminine, of the gendered and radicalized body, but again, taking back that power that was so much missing from that historical narrative. And, in a way, really kind of taking over the very masculine environment of the Legion of Honor. So the Legion of Honor, not only does Rodin's work there, where it's a very male figure, but even the columns themselves can be perceived as more masculine. So I think Mama Ray brings in this very feminine approach of enveloping, of sort of re-radicalizing the space of the site-specific place. And another piece that's included in this is Untitled, and it is the two sculptures that are in the front, where we can see these black figures with a blanket on top of them and heels. And this particular piece is kind of a new direction for Motu, and it was inspired by the murder of Nia Wilson in an Oakland, California bus station. She her death made a huge impression on Motu, and it was a very violent death, and it was due to the fact that Nia Wilson was a woman of color, and due to sort of Motu's just sort of personal reaction to this violent death, she decided to create this site-specific installation where the bodies are in this sort of deep state of repose, almost like Shavasana with yoga, like if you're lying down at the end of yoga, floating on their backs as if they were like in water. And she says, I quote, "It's such an important, tragic time, and I feel the bodies of Black people and Black women and trans women who've been violated and dehumanized are the evidence of deep-seated injustice and unresolved tension." So although this is a new direction in terms of the figurative form, the fact that she is not creating a hybrid form here like she does with her other pieces, instead, these are just straight up female forms of Black women. She's not adding anything, any animals, any natural elements to them. They are just the straight up form. So that's the new direction. But in terms of themes, this idea of humanity and the fact that women are having violence upon them due to the fact that they are women of color, or perhaps in this case, she's also referencing trans women, is certainly something we could associate with other work that she has created. So one last piece from that site-specific installation is this piece called Crocodilus, which is combining this sort of gigantic reptile that is then the human figure who almost is perceived also as alien is perched on top of it. Her legs tucked neatly within the body of the animal's abdomen as if they are one, sort of referencing this sort of equilibrium between them. The rider's harness also is sort of stuck inside the animal's jaws, but not as if in a violent way, but rather in an empowering way. Both the woman and the crocodile are wrapped in a stylized exoskeleton with unbroken lines running all the way up and down each other's bodies, where one begins and one other ends. And I loved this quote from the R21 video where Mutu says, "Combining humans and animals is as old as the human world. The hybrid between a woman and a powerful animal. We've always admired certain creatures for their eloquence and enormous strength." So she's really using animals as a reference point for the empowerment of women. And by making composite forms of them together, she is referencing that power. Okay, so that's it for our lecture. You're going to watch a few videos after this, and then you'll take your quiz. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.